The early summer of 2025 has brought a new chill to US-Canada relations. British Columbia has drawn a firm line in the sand. It recently passed the Economic Stabilization Tariff Response Act. This legislation is a direct answer to what BC perceives as unfair US trade practices. The act grants the provincial government new powers, including imposing retaliatory tariffs on US goods. It's a bold move, signaling that the province is ready to protect its economic interests. The primary purpose of this act is clear leverage. British Columbia aims to pressure the United States into reconsidering certain trade policies. These policies, BC argues, harm its industries, such as forestry and tech. The act is designed to be a flexible tool, allowing for targeted responses. Think of it as a scalpel, not a sledgehammer, in trade negotiations. The message is that BC will no longer passively accept economic aggression. The Alaska Highway is more than just a road. It's a critical economic artery. Stretching over 2,200 kilometers, much of it passes through British Columbia and the Yukon. This highway is the primary land route connecting Alaska to the contiguous United States. Its importance cannot be overstated for Alaskan commerce and daily life. Goods ranging from everyday groceries to essential industrial equipment travel this route. Any disruption to this flow has immediate and significant consequences for the northernmost U.S. state. This geographical reality gives British Columbia considerable leverage in any trade dispute affecting transit. Historically, the Alaska Highway was constructed during World War II to connect Alaska to the U.S. mainland, ensuring a secure supply line. Since then, it has evolved into a vital corridor for trade and tourism. The Economic Stabilization Tariff Response Act implicitly targets this crucial transit route. While not explicitly naming the highway, the act allows BC to impose fees or tolls on U.S. commercial vehicles, using its infrastructure to reach Alaska. This could dramatically increase the cost of doing business for Alaskan companies and impact consumers directly. The reliance on this single dominant land route makes Alaska particularly vulnerable. By potentially restricting or taxing this access, British Columbia is touching a nerve, turning a symbol of cooperation into a point of contention. The roots of the current trade friction can be traced back significantly to the Trump administration. President Donald Trump's America First policy ushered in an era of aggressive trade tactics. He imposed tariffs on a range of goods from various countries, including Canada. Steel and aluminum tariffs, for example, hit Canadian producers hard. These actions disrupted long-standing trade relationships and created an atmosphere of unpredictability. While President Trump is no longer in office as of 2025, the legacy of his protectionist stance continues to influence trade dynamics. Trump's tariff threats were often broad and seemingly indiscriminate. They were justified as necessary to protect American jobs and industries. However, many economists argued they harmed American consumers and businesses as well. For Canada, a nation heavily reliant on trade with the U.S., these tariffs were a major economic challenge. The Canadian federal government responded with its own retaliatory tariffs. This tit-for-tat escalation created a tense environment, setting a precedent for the kind of provincial action BC is now undertaking. The argument from British Columbia today echoes some of the justifications used during the Trump era, albeit from a different perspective. BC feels its own industries are under threat from U.S. policies. The Economic Stabilization Tariff Response Act can be seen as a defensive measure, born out of the frustration that traditional diplomatic channels were not sufficient to counter perceived U.S. economic pressure. Premier David Eby of British Columbia has emerged as a central figure in this escalating trade dispute. His government's Economic Stabilization Tariff Response Act signals a more assertive approach. Eby has stated that British Columbia will not stand by while its economic interests are undermined. The act allows for flexibility in applying pressure. This could mean new tolls on U.S. commercial vehicles heading to Alaska. or new environmental levies on U.S. goods transiting through British Columbia ports. These measures are already creating economic pressure on U.S. businesses. Companies relying on the British Columbia corridor face new uncertainties and potential cost increases. The current trade tensions with the U.S., exemplified by British Columbia's actions, are fueling a broader discussion within Canada. This discussion centers on the need for greater interprovincial economic integration. For years, internal trade barriers between Canadian provinces have been a persistent issue. These barriers can sometimes make it easier for a province to trade with a U.S. state than with a neighboring Canadian province. The logic now gaining traction is that if external trade becomes more uncertain, Canada must strengthen its internal economic ties to build resilience and foster domestic growth. This push for a stronger internal market is not entirely new. However, the recent friction with the U.S. has given it renewed urgency. Canadian policymakers are looking at ways to reduce red tape, harmonize regulations, and improve infrastructure to facilitate the flow of goods, services, and labor across provincial borders. The idea is to create a more unified Canadian domestic market. This would make Canadian businesses less reliant on any single external partner, including the United States. It's about building economic shock absorbers within the Canadian Confederation itself. Premier Eby's assertive stance in British Columbia indirectly supports this narrative of Canadian self-reliance. The federal government in Ottawa is cautiously observing these developments. Canada is increasingly looking inward to build economic strength, potentially leading to a significant rebalancing of the Canadian economy over the next decade. Alaska is in a precarious position due to British Columbia's new trade assertiveness. The state's economy relies heavily on transit routes through British Columbia. New tolls and fees on the Alaska Highway threaten this lifeline. Alaskan businesses are bracing for increased costs. These costs could range from higher shipping fees to delays. For a state with a high cost of living, these burdens are a serious concern. The economic impacts on Alaska could be widespread. Retailers may pass on higher transportation costs to consumers. Construction projects could face delays and budget overruns. Alaska's resource industries could also feel the pinch. The state's government is under pressure to find solutions. Alaskan officials are urging federal counterparts to address the situation with Canadian authorities. The focus is on mitigating damage and finding a diplomatic solution. Alaskan leaders must navigate complex state, national, and international interests. The escalating trade dispute, sparked by British Columbia's firm stance and the U.S. policies that preceded it, is now rippling outwards. We are seeing political and economic retaliations, or at least the serious threat of them, from various actors. Alaskan officials are publicly condemning British Columbia's actions and hinting at potential boycotts or legal challenges. On the Canadian side, there is a palpable sense of support in some quarters for British Columbia's assertiveness. The U.S. federal government is in a complex position. It needs to manage the broader relationship with Canada, its largest trading partner. Options range from diplomatic negotiations to lodging formal complaints under existing trade agreements. The Canadian federal government in Ottawa faces a similar challenge. The potential long-term effects of these tensions on U.S.-Canada relations and trade stability are considerable. Each dispute, even if resolved, chips away at the foundation of trust and cooperation. Ultimately, the path forward could lead to resolution through negotiation and compromise.